The bucket of a 30-ton excavator passed over my head, close enough that I felt the hydraulic fluid heat coming off it, and I did not move, because I was standing in 2 feet of black water on my own land, and the only thing between Sable Slough and 8 dump trucks full of crushed limestone was me. It was 7 in the morning on a Saturday. The operator leaned out of his cab and screamed over the diesel that the board had approved it, and I could take it up with them. And behind him, the trucks were backing to the edge of the slough in a line, tailgates up, dumping rock into water that had been sitting in that low ground since before my grandfather was born. And on the bank, in white sneakers that had never touched mud in their life, stood Rhonda Vale, president of the Cypress Landing Estates Homeowners Association, with her arms crossed and a cup of coffee. And she looked at me standing chest deep in her mosquito problem and said, "It's a mosquito pit, Mr. Ellison. Nobody's coming out here for a puddle." She was right about the puddle. She was catastrophically wrong about who was coming. My name is Wade Ellison. I was 47 that spring, and before I cut back to part-time consulting and moved on to my grandfather's 40 acres, I spent 10 years as a certified professional wetland scientist, doing delineations and jurisdictional determinations under contract for the state and for the Army Corps of Engineers. 10 years of walking other people's property in waders with an auger and a soil chart, deciding, on behalf of the federal government, which water in this country is federal water and which water is just water. So I want you to understand what I was actually looking at while a man in a cab called me an obstruction. I wasn't looking at a puddle. I was looking at 9 acres of forested slough with hydric soils, obligate wetland vegetation, and a shallow, continuous surface channel that runs out the east side and into Hollis Creek, a permanent, year-round stream 300 yards downslope. Continuous surface connection to a permanent tributary. That is not a legal detail. That is the whole ballgame, and it means Sable Slough is jurisdictional water of the United States, and dumping fill into it without a Section 404 permit isn't a homeowners association improving an amenity. It's a federal violation committed with a rented excavator in daylight in front of a man who used to write the reports. I didn't grab the machine. I want to be clear about that because everything that came after depended on it. If I put a hand on that operator or climbed on that track, the story becomes a man with a temper and an assault charge, and Rhonda Vale cries on the local news in clean sneakers. So I stood there, and I filmed, and I called out the time and the coordinates for the microphone, and I estimated the load count out loud. 8 trucks, roughly 12 cubic yards each, 96 yards of clean limestone into jurisdictional water, the way I would narrate a site inspection. Because in my world, a thing that isn't documented didn't happen. Then I waded out, dripping, past Rhonda's sneakers, and went up to the house and changed my clothes. And that evening, there was an envelope in my mailbox. A citation from the Cypress Landing Architectural and Grounds Committee. $400 for obstructing approved community improvements. They had dumped 96 cubic yards of rock into my wetland and then fined me for standing in it. I laughed out loud in my kitchen, the short, ugly laugh you laugh when someone hands you your own evidence, gift-wrapped with a receipt. Here's what nobody at Cypress Landing knew about the quiet guy at the end of the county road, and it's the part I'd been doing for a decade without ever thinking of it as a weapon. Every Tuesday for 10 years, I had walked the slough. Water samples, staff gauge readings, 3 shallow monitoring wells I'd sunk myself, read weekly, logged by hand, and then typed up. Because that's what you do when your profession is water and the water is right outside your door. 10 years of hydrology data, 10 years of soil logs, photographs, species counts, seasonal high water marks, and the exact date every spring when the frogs started. It was a hobby. It was also, though it hadn't occurred to me until the moment those trucks started backing up, a baseline data set that no violator on earth could argue with. Because here's the standard defense when someone fills a wetland. Prove it was ever a wetland. You can't see it now, can you? It's under the rock. Show me. And most people can't. Most people have a memory and a couple of phone pictures, and a federal case turns into a soil scientist food fight over a site that no longer exists. I had 10 years of Tuesdays. That night, I put together a certified letter and sent it 3 ways: to the association, to Ardent Community Management, and to Delmar Hicks personally, the contractor whose name was on the excavator door. I kept it short and professional, the way you do when you want a document that reads well later. Sable Slough is jurisdictional water under the Clean Water Act, with a continuous surface connection to Hollis Creek. The discharge of fill material into it requires a Section 404 permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. No such permit exists. Cease all work immediately. I attached a delineation summary and my professional credentials so that nobody could later stand in front of a judge and say they'd been told to stop by an angry neighbor with an opinion. Their answer was not a pause. It was a schedule. By Monday afternoon, Rhonda had told Hicks to have the slough closed out by the end of the week, because the whole thing was a race now, and she knew it. And Cypress Landing had a reason to hurry that I didn't fully understand yet. Rhonda Vale had staked her entire presidency on what she called the amenity project: 2 tennis courts and 40 parking spaces on the unusable back acreage. And she had already levied and spent the special assessment that paid for it. That project was her legacy and her survival. And the only thing standing between it and a ribbon cutting was 9 acres of blackwater and a man in waders. So on Tuesday, I did what a wetland scientist does. I flagged the boundary. Pink and black delineation flags on wire every 50 feet along the wetland edge, staked with my own hands on my own property, plus signs at the corners with the parcel number and my name. It's not a legal barrier. It's a professional statement, and it's the thing you photograph so that later, in a room with a federal inspector, everyone can see exactly where the line was and exactly who knew about it. By Wednesday morning, the flags were gone. Not blown down, pulled, wire and all, and thrown in the ditch, and 2 men in reflective vests with Cypress Landing compliance embroidered across the chest were standing at the edge of my tree line, and one of them was up on a stump reaching for the trail camera I'd strapped to a water oak 2 years earlier to watch the otters. I have been in a lot of muddy places with a lot of unhappy people, and I have learned exactly how much force is enough. I crossed the 50 feet at a walk, not a run, and I said, once, clearly, that the camera was my property on my property, and he needed to take his hand off it. He didn't. So I took his wrist, not a punch, not a swing, just a hard, deliberate peel of a man's hand off a thing that wasn't his, and I lifted the camera off the strap myself and stepped back with it. The second one came in and shoved me square in the chest with both hands, and I gave 2 feet of ground and stayed on my feet and did not swing. And both of them stood there breathing hard, waiting for the thing I was supposed to do next, the thing that would have ended this whole story in a county jail. I didn't do it. I held up the camera, still recording, and I told them they were now on video, on private property, having assaulted the landowner, and that I'd be reporting it. And then I called the sheriff on them, which felt, at the time, like a reasonable use of a phone. The deputy was a decent kid and completely useless. He looked at the pulled flags, he looked at my deed and the county GIS on the hood of his cruiser, which showed the slough sitting comfortably inside my parcel lines. He looked at 96 cubic yards of limestone sitting in what was very obviously water. And then he said the sentence I'd known was coming since the moment I dialed. The sentence every one of them says. "Sir, I understand you're frustrated, but this is really a civil matter. It's a property dispute with your HOA. You'll want to talk to a lawyer." He wrote me a case number with the enthusiasm of a man filling out his own parking ticket. And Rhonda Vale, standing 40 feet away with her arms crossed, watched the cruiser pull out of my lane and said it loud enough for the camera to catch, one more time, because she couldn't help herself. "See, nobody's coming." I want you to sit with that moment, because it's the moment this whole thing turns. She was right. The sheriff wasn't coming back. The county wasn't coming. Rhonda Vale had spent 10 years learning that if you're loud enough and you have a board vote in your hand, local authority will shrug and call it civil, and she was correct. And she'd built an entire personality out of being correct about it. I stood in my lane and watched her walk back to her golf cart. And I said into my own camera, quietly, the only thing I've ever said in this whole business that I'd call a promise. She's right. The sheriff's not coming. But I've got a number the sheriff doesn't have. Then I went inside and filed a complaint with the Army Corps of Engineers District Office and the Regional EPA Water Division. Not a phone call to a switchboard, a complaint package. Latitude and longitude to 6 decimals, the parcel number, aerial imagery, my delineation, the continuous surface connection to Hollis Creek, an estimated fill volume with truck counts and dates, photographs of the discharge in progress, and 10 years of hydrology data attached as an appendix. I know what those inspectors need because I used to be the guy they sent. I know that a complaint that says, "My neighbor filled a swamp," goes in a queue. And I know that a complaint with coordinates, volumes, dates, a professional delineation, and a decade of baseline hydrology does not go in a queue. It goes on somebody's desk. But here's the thing about federal wheels. They turn. And they turn all the way through. But they do not turn fast. And Delmar Hicks had 8 trucks running right now. Every day was another 200 yards of rock, another acre of slough that would have to be excavated back out later. And Rhonda knew it. Her whole strategy was velocity. Fill it, finish it, pave it, and let the lawyers argue over a parking lot that already exists, because nobody digs up a finished parking lot. She wasn't wrong about that either. It's the single most effective move in the destruction of American wetlands. Get it done before anybody with authority shows up, then apologize with a check. And they got nastier while they hurried, because that's what they do when they're on the clock. They recorded a lien against my parcel for the unpaid $400, plus fines that were now accruing daily for continued obstruction. Compliance started walking my tree line every morning with a camera. And on Thursday, they parked a pickup across my field access. My lane, on my deed, so a delivery couldn't reach my equipment shed. I didn't move their truck, and I didn't touch it. I photographed the plate, called a tow, and stood in my own lane with coffee, while 2 extremely surprised men watched their pickup get winched onto a flatbed. The tow driver, who knew exactly whose lane it was because he'd been hauling my hay equipment for 6 years, tipped his hat on the way out. That was the day I finally went into the association's old minutes, because something had been nagging at me since the beginning. Rhonda kept calling it a mosquito pit, a puddle, unusable back acreage. That's the language of a woman who thinks the ground is worthless. But you don't design a 40-space parking lot and 2 tennis courts on ground you think is worthless without somebody at some point checking whether you can. So I pulled 3 years of Cypress Landing board minutes off the association's own portal, and in a routine expenditure line from 26 months earlier, I found it. A payment, $11,000, to an environmental consulting firm. And a name. Why, I sat there wondering, would an association absolutely certain that its back 40 was just a puddle pay $11,000 to a wetland consultant? Her name was Priya Raman, and she had a small firm 2 counties over, and when I called her and said the words Sable Slough, she went quiet for about 4 seconds and then said, "Oh, thank God, somebody finally asked." She sent me her report that afternoon, 26 months old, 41 pages, stamped and signed. She had walked the same ground I walk every Tuesday. She'd found the same hydric soils, the same obligate vegetation, the same shallow channel running east into Hollis Creek. Her conclusion, in the flat, professional language of my entire industry, was that Sable Slough was almost certainly jurisdictional, that any fill would require an individual Section 404 permit, that the permitting process would take 18 to 24 months, and that given the availability of upland alternatives on the association's own property, they had 40 acres of dry ground they could have built on, the Corps would very likely deny the permit outright. She had presented it to the board in executive session. They thanked her. They paid her invoice. They never called her again, and the report never appeared in a single subsequent set of minutes, or in the amenity project file, or in the packet the members voted on when they approved the special assessment. They knew. They had known for 26 months. They had paid $11,000 to be told exactly how illegal it was, and then they had buried the report and hired an excavator. And once you know that, the whole thing rearranges itself, because this was never ignorance. It was arithmetic. Rhonda Vale had done the math that developers have been doing in this country for 40 years, and it is the most rational, most disgusting calculation in land use. A permit costs 2 years and probably a denial. A fine costs money. Fill it now, take the fine, keep the parking lot. She wasn't gambling that nobody would notice. She was betting that noticing wouldn't matter, that the penalty would be a line item, and the courts would be a shrug, and the parking lot would still be there in the spring. A fine is cheaper than a permit. That's the whole religion. And the only reason it works, when it works, is that the people it happens to don't have a decade of Tuesdays and a phone number. They ran the trucks at night after that, which told me Priya's report wasn't the only thing they were racing. Thursday at 9:30, under work lights, Hicks pushed for the last of the east side. He didn't find one man on a porch. Word had gotten around. I'd walked the aerials and Priya's report door to door, and there were 5 of us standing on my property line with our phones up. My neighbor, Ollie Sparks, in his bathrobe, filming a fully lit excavator working in a wetland at night with no permit. Their compliance guys came at us, and one of them put a hand on Ollie's shoulder, and I said, loud and flat, "He's 71 years old, on private property, and you're on camera." And the hand came off. I moved my own tractor across my own field entrance and shut it down and pocketed the key, which is not a barricade, it's a piece of farm equipment parked on a farm, and it is remarkable how effective that distinction can be at 10 at night. I called the sheriff again. Same result, same script, same tired voice. "Civil matter, sir." But this time, I asked him for something specific, and I asked him to write it down. Log the time. Log that heavy equipment was operating in standing water. Log the truck count. Log that I reported unpermitted discharge of fill into waters of the United States, and that I stated on the record that a federal complaint was already filed. He looked at me like I was speaking Portuguese, and he wrote it. Because I didn't need the deputy to stop anything. I needed a time-stamped government record of exactly what was happening, made by a uniformed county employee, and I got it. And it cost me nothing but the small pleasure of watching Rhonda Vale smirk at a cruiser leaving my driveway for the second time. Then the sky did in one night what I'd have needed a year of hearings to explain. The first real spring storm came through the following Tuesday, 5 inches in about 8 hours, and Sable Slough did what it had done for 200 years, which is nothing, because it couldn't. 96 cubic yards, then 400, then 1,100 yards of limestone had filled the floodplain storage that used to swallow that water and let it out slow through the channel and the culvert under the association's own entrance road. The culvert I clear of beaver sticks and leaf mat every spring, which I've done every year since my father did it, and which I mentioned to exactly nobody because it had never once been interesting. That water still had to go somewhere, so it went where the rock told it to go. Straight downhill, fast, through a culvert sized for a slow-release wetland and not for a limestone chute, and it took out the culvert headwall, and then it went across Cypress Landing Drive, and then into the clubhouse lower level, and then into the pro shop, and then into the crawl spaces of the 11 homes on the low end of Egret Court. I stood on my porch at 6 in the morning, watching a stormwater company pumping out Rhonda Vale's clubhouse, and I did not feel much of anything except the specific professional satisfaction of watching a hydrologic model verify itself. But I didn't gloat. I got my camera and my gauge, and I documented every inch of it, upstream and down, because it was no longer a nice piece of irony. It was evidence, proof of the wetland's function, in dollars, in her own basement, and the fastest possible answer to the question every violator eventually asks, which is, what's the harm? The harm was standing in the pro shop. The harm was 11 crawl spaces. Delmar Hicks called me the next morning at 7, and I knew before I picked up. He'd gotten the first pump-out invoice, and somewhere in there, a lawyer had finally explained to him the thing that Rhonda had never bothered to mention. Under the Clean Water Act, liability for an unpermitted discharge attaches to the person who physically discharges the fill, not the board. not the association's insurance. Delmar Hicks, personally, the man with his hands on the levers, plus the officers who directed him. He was not calling about tennis courts. He was calling to make sure I understood he had emails. He had a lot of emails. And in the middle of them, from Rhonda Vale, dated 3 weeks before the first truck rolled, in reply to Hicks asking, in writing, God bless him, because he was covering himself even then, whether they had the permits. Just get it filled. We'll deal with the paperwork after. A fine is cheaper than a permit. I read that sentence about 6 times. Because I'd said it out loud to myself in my kitchen a week earlier as a theory of the case, and here she was, in her own words, in a discoverable email, laying out the entire crime with the smug precision of a woman who has never in her life been asked to explain herself to anyone who mattered. She had written down the motive. She had written down the intent. And intent, in federal environmental law, is not a detail. It's the difference between a check and a criminal referral, because a knowing violation of the Clean Water Act is not a fine, it's a charge. My phone rang the following Monday from a number I didn't know, and a woman introduced herself as a regulatory project manager with the Core District Office. She'd read my package. She'd pulled the aerials and the National Wetlands Inventory layer, and she'd been out to Hollis Creek herself the previous fall on an unrelated file. And she asked me 2 questions. Was the surface connection still intact on the east side? And did I still have the raw hydrology data, not just the summary? And when I said yes to both, she said, "We're coming out Tuesday. EPA is coming with us." They came in 2 federal SUVs, and they came right through the Cypress landing gate, past a man in a reflective vest whose entire training consisted of telling landscapers where to park. A core regulatory specialist named Dana Whitcomb, an EPA enforcement officer named Miguel Arroyo, and a soil scientist. And all 3 of them got out and put on waders in the parking lot, which I want to note is the exact moment I knew Rhonda was finished, because people who put on waders in your driveway are not there to hear your side of it. The determination took them about 40 minutes. It would have taken 6 months if it had been anybody else's property, because normally you're reconstructing a site that's been erased, arguing about what the soils used to be under 2 feet of imported rock, hiring dueling experts, litigating a ghost. But I handed Dana Whitcomb a 3-ring binder with 10 years of weekly staff gauge readings, monitoring well data, soil logs, seasonal photographs from fixed points, and species counts, plus Priya Raman's 26-month-old stamped delineation, reaching the identical conclusion. 2 independent professional determinations, a decade of baseline hydrology, and an intact surface channel they could walk with their own boots from the fill edge to Hollis Creek. Arroyo followed that channel to the creek himself, came back, and said, to nobody in particular, "Yeah, that's jurisdictional." Rhonda Vale arrived about then, because of course she did, and she made the mistake of her life, which was to talk to a federal enforcement officer the way she talked to the sheriff. She explained that this was an internal community matter. She explained that the board had approved the improvement and that there had been a vote, and that she had the resolution in her office if he'd like to see it. And Miguel Arroyo, who I'd guess has heard some version of that speech 400 times, let her finish, and then said, pleasantly, "Ma'am, a board resolution is not a permit from the United States." And then she started the sentence I had been waiting on for 3 weeks. "You can't even prove there was ever a wetland out here. It's just a..." And Dana Whitcomb, without any particular drama, held up my binder and said, "We have 10 years of data and your own consultant's report from 26 months ago. Would you like to see them?" And I want to be honest, that's when I finally allowed myself to enjoy it. Because they'd already found Priya's report. It had been produced along with everything else, since Ardent Community Management, staring down a federal enforcement matter with its manager's name on the project file, had discovered a sudden and total commitment to cooperation. It was sitting in Whitcomb's folder next to Hicks's emails. 26 months of knowing. And in the middle of it all, in the audio I later handed over, Rhonda Vale's own voice from that first Saturday, thin and clear over a diesel engine. "Nobody's coming out here for a puddle." They stapled the cease and desist to the door of Delmar Hicks's excavator. Not the clubhouse, not the office, the machine. The notice of violation came 9 days later, and it's the part that Rhonda Vale, for all her arithmetic, had never actually run the numbers on. Civil penalties under the Clean Water Act accrue per day per violation, from the date of the discharge, at a number that has more digits than the fine she'd budgeted for, and doesn't stop climbing while you argue about it. Then came the restoration order, which is the thing nobody outside the field ever sees coming. The association was directed to remove every cubic yard of fill it had placed, under federal supervision, restore the original grade and hydrology, replant with the appropriate native species, and monitor the site, with reports, for years. Not pay damages, not make it right. Dig it out, all of it, yourselves. The knowing violation evidence, the buried report, the email, went to the U.S. Attorney's Office as a criminal referral naming Rhonda Vale and Delmar Hicks personally. And a referral like that does not care that you have resigned from a homeowners association. Hicks lost his contractor's license and every state pre-qualification he'd spent 20 years earning. Which is what happens when a man decides that just get it filled is an instruction he's allowed to follow. Ardent Community Management terminated the Cypress Landing contract inside a month, because a management company is only worth its fee until its project manager is a witness. The special assessment was gone. Spent on rock they now had to pay to take back out, plus penalties, plus the clubhouse remediation, plus 11 crawl spaces on Egret Court. Rhonda Vale resigned before the recall petition finished circulating, and the amenity project died the way it had always been going to die, just 26 months and several felonies later than Priya Raman had told them it would. That whole summer, I sat on my porch and watched Cypress Landing's contractors dig the rock back out. The same limestone. The same trucks, more or less, running the other direction. It took 11 weeks to remove what had taken 9 days to dump, which is the truest fact I know about this entire line of work. They restored the grade. They restored the channel. They planted what the order told them to plant. And here's the ending. Rhonda Vale bought with her arithmetic, the part I genuinely could not have arranged on my best day. A wetland that gets restored under a federal order doesn't go back to being an anonymous mosquito pit that the next board can quietly bulldoze in 10 years. It gets a mitigation plan, a monitoring schedule, and a permanent protective status, filed and recorded and enforceable forever. The amenity project ended with Cypress Landing Estates paying out of its own pocket to make Sable Slough permanently protected federal wetland, in perpetuity, in writing. It came back fast, the way sloughs do, and the following spring, on a warm night in late March, the frogs started up in Sable Slough loud enough that you could hear them from the clubhouse patio. I know because a neighbor complained about it at the annual meeting. The new board told her there was nothing they could do. Author's note, stepping in for a minute, because this one isn't about a stubborn board, it's about a calculation. Rhonda Vale wasn't ignorant. She'd paid $11,000, 26 months earlier, to be told exactly how illegal it was, and then she buried the report and ran the oldest math in American land development. A permit costs 2 years and a probable denial. A fine costs money, so fill it and pay later. She wasn't betting nobody would notice. She was betting noticing wouldn't matter. It usually does work, and that's the uncomfortable part. It works because the sheriff says civil matter and means it, and because the standard defense, prove there was ever a wetland, it's under the rock now, usually wins. What beat her was 10 years of Tuesdays. Wade's weekly gauge readings and soil logs weren't a strategy, they were a habit. But they made the erasure defense impossible before she could finish saying it, and they turned a 6-month determination into 40 minutes in waiters. Then her own email finished her. A fine is cheaper than a permit is motive, in writing, and a knowing violation isn't a check, it's a referral. Takeaways. Know that wetland and stream protections are federal, and that the Corps and EPA are not the sheriff. Document your own ground routinely. Baseline data is the one thing nobody can manufacture later. And remember, liability follows the hands on the levers, not the vote. Question for you. She was right that nobody local was coming. So how many of these fills happen every year because the owner didn't know there was a number to call?